The wind swept across the endless prairie, carrying with it the smell of dry grass and the faint echo of hooves that once thundered through these lands. The sky burned gold as the sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the earth. And for a moment the world felt caught between two times, one fading, the other yet to be born. It was in this silence, heavy and alive, that the story truly began. A land vast and unforgiving, where freedom was both a blessing and a curse, and where every man and woman carried the weight of their choices like the dust on their skin. He rode at the front, tall and steady, on the back of a chestnut horse, his bare chest marked with the paint of his people, his gaze fixed on the horizon as though he could see beyond what lay visible to the eye. The feathers in his headdress swayed with each gust, a living crown that spoke of both honor and burden. Beside him, a woman sat her horse with quiet strength. Her hair flowed loose in the evening wind, and around her neck lay strings of beads that caught the last of the sun's light. She did not speak, but her eyes held questions that pressed harder with each passing mile. Together they moved, as if the land itself had called them forth, bound by duty and by something deeper, something unnamed. The plains stretched far in every direction, yet there was no comfort in the openness. Danger was not always loud. Sometimes it lay hidden, waiting, watching. Each trail told a story, each broken branch whispered of those who had passed before. The riders knew this well, for they had grown under skies that showed no mercy and on earth that gave nothing freely. Still their people had survived, and survival was not just a matter of strength, but of spirit. The old song spoke of balance, of giving as much as you took, of walking in step with the earth and the wind. But the songs were being drowned now, replaced by the creak of wagon wheels, the strike of axes, the spread of fences that cut the land into pieces. The man carried more than the weight of his people's traditions on his shoulders. He carried a promise, one spoken over a dying fire when the night was thick with sorrow. His father's voice had been weak, but his words carried the sharpness of steel. You will not let them forget who we are. It was not simply an order, it was the binding of generations. The last breath of an elder passed into the lungs of the young. Now every step his horse took was measured by that vow. Every glance at the horizon a reminder of what had been left in his hands. The woman had her own burden, though she had never spoken it aloud. She was not one to break silence unless it served a purpose, but within her rested a restlessness that no ride could soothe. She felt the pull of the world beyond, the whispers of paths untaken, the possibility that somewhere in the far-off hills life might beat to a different rhythm. Yet she had chosen to ride here, beside him, not out of duty, but out of choice, and that choice came with a shadow. For with every mile, the road behind her grew longer, and the chance of turning back faded with the setting sun. As twilight thickened, they came upon the remnants of a camp ashes still warm. Prints in the dirt, scraps of fabric caught on low branches. The man dismounted, crouching low, running his fingers through the soil as if it might tell him more than sight alone could offer. The woman scanned the edges of the clearing, her hand resting on the carved handle of a knife tied at her side. Neither spoke, yet both understood. Others had been here not long before. Whether friend or foe remained uncertain. But the tension that filled the air was enough to set the horses shifting uneasily. The prairie had no walls, no doors to lock at night, no certainty of what tomorrow would bring. Trust was as rare as rain, and even the most familiar faces could one day become strangers. In times like these, it was not only the land they had to guard against, but the hearts of men driven by hunger, fear, or greed. The man rose slowly, his jaw set. He looked to the horizon again, and this time there was no calm in his eyes, only a storm building. Something was coming. He felt it in his bones, in the way the earth seemed to hum beneath his boots, in the way the wind carried warnings too faint for words. Night fell fast. The sky thick with stars, but neither found rest. The woman sat by the fire they built, her eyes catching the glow, while the man stood watch, scanning the darkness as if he could peel back the veil of night. The crackle of flames could not silence the thoughts that pressed in from every side. What awaited them beyond the next rise? What force pressed against their way of life, threatening to scatter it like dust on the wind? The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the answer. The old stories told of trials, of spirits that tested the living, of journeys that shaped the soul. Perhaps this was one of those trials, though neither would dare speak it. Yet deep down they both knew the road they rode was no ordinary path. It was one that would demand sacrifice, one that would test loyalty, one that would decide more than just their own fates. The prairie stretched endless before them, but so did the questions. And somewhere in the vast dark, unseen eyes were watching, waiting for the moment to strike. The man's hand tightened on the leather strap across his chest. The woman shifted slightly, her gaze cutting into the night. Neither spoke the words that burned on their tongues, for sometimes silence carried more weight than sound. The fire flickered low, the horses stamped nervously, and the air seemed to thicken with something unseen yet undeniable. A choice was drawing near, closer with every heartbeat. And when it came, it would not only decide their future, but the fate of all who still called this land their home. The horizon held no answers, only shadows. Yet in those shadows lay the first threads of a story that had only just begun. The night was long, and though the fire burned down to glowing embers, sleep never truly came. The man remained on his feet, shoulders tense, eyes searching the horizon, as though he might catch the first flicker of danger before it arrived. The woman, though sitting close to the warmth of the fire, did not allow her body to relax. Her hand stayed near her knife, her ears sharp to every rustle in the grass. The horses shifted and snorted quietly, sensing what their riders felt, a heaviness in the air that did not belong to an ordinary night. Something waited beyond the dark, unseen but not absent. It's like a shadow that moved without sound. As the hours stretched on, the woman studied the man from the corner of her eye. His strength was plain, but strength was not what kept him standing watch when exhaustion pulled at his frame. It was something deeper, a fire that burned within him, one she had seen before when he spoke of his father's last words. That vow weighed on him more than he admitted. She wondered if he realized how visible it was, how the promise shaped every step he took, how it would not let him rest. She understood duty, but she also understood what it did to a person when it was carried too long without relief. Still, she said nothing, for she knew words would not ease the burden. Words would only fall like rain on stone, heard but not absorbed. When the first light of dawn stretched across the prairie, painting the sky in shades of fire and rose, the man finally lowered himself to the ground. He let his horse graze freely while he crouched beside the dying embers, his fingers sifting through the ashes of the fire they had built. His silence was not empty, but filled with thought, as if each piece of ash held meaning only he could read. The woman stretched her legs, looking east toward the rising sun. The vastness before them seemed endless, yet within it lay signs of change. Smoke rose faintly in the far distance, a thin column that drifted upward before dissolving into the morning air. It was not from their fire. It was from another. The woman's gaze sharpened, her body leaning forward slightly. "Others," she finally said, her voice low but firm. The man followed her eyes, his jaw tightening as he took in the sight. He gave no answer, but she knew he had seen it too. That thin line of smoke could mean many things. It could be a camp like theirs, harmless wanderers seeking warmth, or it could be something else, a group whose presence carried danger. Out here every encounter was uncertain, and trust was a fragile thread as easily broken. They packed their few belongings in silence, the rhythm of their movements practiced, efficient. The man secured his weapons, checking each carefully before mounting his horse. The woman tied her hair back, her eyes still fixed on the distant smoke. They did not ride toward it directly, but their path bent closer with each mile, as though drawn by a force they could not resist. The prairie offered little in the way of hiding places, only rolling grass and the occasional rise. But both of them knew how to use the land, how to ride in a way that left little trace. The old ways taught them patience, and patience was their shield. As the day wore on, the woman's mind drifted to the stories told around fires long ago. She remembered the voices of the elders, deep and steady, weaving tales of times when the land was whole and unbroken. When her people moved freely with the herds, following the rhythm of the seasons, those stories had shaped her, given her a sense of belonging to something greater than herself. But those same stories now felt like ghosts. The herds were thinner, the rivers less certain, and the earth itself seemed weary. The new world pressing in from the east did not care for balance or rhythm. It cared only for possession. She wondered if the children growing now would even know the old songs, or if they would vanish like smoke in the wind. The man, though he rarely spoke of such things, carried those same fears. His silence was not emptiness, but weight. He had seen fences stretching across the prairie, cutting through hunting grounds, carving up land that once belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. He had seen wagons rolling west, carrying families with eyes full of hope but hands eager to claim what was not theirs. He had seen rivers where the fish no longer swam freely, where the banks were lined with tracks of animals that no longer roamed as they once had. Each memory was another stone in his chest, another reminder of the vow he had made. By late afternoon, the smoke they had seen at dawn was gone, as though the earth had swallowed it whole. Yet the unease it left behind did not fade. The man slowed his horse, raising a hand to signal caution. The woman followed his lead, her eyes scanning every rise, every shadow. A flock of birds burst suddenly from the tall grass ahead, their wings beating frantically as they rose into the sky. Both riders tensed. Birds did not scatter without reason. Something or someone had disturbed them. They dismounted, leading their horses quietly as they approached the rise ahead. The man moved first, crouching low, his body as still as the stones beneath him. The woman stayed close, her breath steady, her hand brushing the hilt of her knife. When they reached the top of the rise, the sight before them froze them in place. Below lay a camp, but not one like theirs. Tents stood in a rough circle, smoke rising from a large fire at the center. Figures moved about, some tending horses, others sharpening weapons. There were more than a dozen, perhaps 20, and their presence was not peaceful. Even from this distance, the riders could sense it. These were not families passing through. These were men who carried trouble like a second skin. The woman's stomach tightened, but her face showed nothing. She glanced at the man, waiting for his signal. His eyes were hard, his jaw set, but he did not move. Instead, he studied the camp below, memorizing every detail. The people there laughed loudly, their voices carrying across the wind, careless of who might hear. Their fire burned too bright, too wasteful, as if the land itself were theirs to consume. And their horses' strong, restless animals stood tethered, stamping the ground as though they too felt the weight of their riders' intentions. The man finally leaned back, pulling away from the ridge. The woman followed, both of them sinking into the tall grass until they were hidden again. Neither spoke, for the truth was already clear. They had stumbled upon something that could not be ignored. Whether fate had led them here or chance, it did not matter. What lay below was a sign, perhaps even the beginning of what his father had warned about. The woman's thoughts raced, her heart caught between fear and resolve. The man's silence only deepened, the weight of his vow pressing harder than ever. As evening drew near, they retreated to a safe distance, setting their camp where the land dipped low, hidden from sight. The fire they built was small, only enough to keep the chill at bay. They sat close, their faces lit by the faint glow, the night pressing in around them. For the first time since they had left their people behind, the woman spoke of what weighed on her heart. She spoke of the old stories, of the songs that risked being lost, of the children who might grow never knowing the rhythm of their ancestors. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held a sorrow she could not hide. The man listened, his face carved in shadow, and though he did not answer at once, she knew her words had struck deep. Finally he lifted his gaze, his voice low but strong. "We cannot turn away," he said. "What we saw today will not remain there. It will spread, as it always does." His words carried the weight of truth, and though they chilled the air between them, they also gave it shape. The woman nodded slowly, the firelight flickering in her eyes. She did not argue, for she knew he was right. The road ahead was dark. The choices they would face would not allow for silence much longer. The prairie stretched wide around them, endless and wild, but the sense of freedom it once gave was gone. In its place stood something else, something heavier. The night whispered of unseen forces, of eyes that watched from the shadows, paths that would soon cross whether they wished it or not. The horses stirred uneasily, as though sensing the same truth. And as the fire burned low, the two riders sat in silence, bound by duty, by choice, and by the storm they could no longer avoid. The horizon promised no peace, only questions, and the answers waited just beyond the darkness. Where the land held secrets yet to be revealed, dawn came thin and pale, and the riders moved before their shadows could form. The man and the woman kept low along a dry creek bed that curled like a scar through the prairie. They paused at each bend to listen. Far behind them, the circle of rough tents and the bright, wasteful fire burned in memory. The man pictured the faces he had seen in that brief glimpse. Hard mouths, fast hands, a way of standing that told of men who believed the land owed them. He thought of his father's vow and felt the pull of it again, a rope across his chest. The woman read the ground as they went. She saw tracks that did not belong to deer or antelope. She saw the print of a boot near a patch of crushed sage and placed her hand above it as if taking the measure of a stranger's step. By midday, they found a ridge that overlooked a thin trail used by traders and hunters. The trail ran east to a small town where smoke from a sawmill smudged the sky on clear days. West it ran to country where the wind did most of the talking. From the ridge, they could see riders moving in twos and threes, not in a hurry, but with purpose. The man counted quietly. The woman watched their mouths and noticed that they did not smile. One rider glanced back often, as if expecting a chase. Another wore a red scarf tied around his hat. These men did not look like families. They looked like a plan. They turned their horses toward a line of old cottonwoods along a stream. There, hidden by the trees, stood a shack built long ago by someone who had not stayed. The roof had gaps, and the door hung crooked, but the walls kept wind out. They decided to wait until night and watch the trail again. While they waited, the woman told the man about a spring far north where the water came sweet from a rock. She had gone there as a child with her mother. People left tobacco leaves and small carved figures near the water, not to own the spring, but to honor it. She frowned as she spoke. Fences had grown near that spring last winter, she said. A rancher had built them without asking. He let the water flow, but he called it his. The man listened with a tight jaw. He knew there would be a day when that spring would not flow free. Near sunset, a boy came down the trail on a mule. He was small and thin, and his clothes were too big for him. He held a sack tight against his chest. The woman saw him first and touched the man's arm. They stepped from the trees in a way that showed they meant no harm. The mule shied, but the boy kept his seat. His eyes were quick and wary. The man lifted an open hand and asked where the boy was headed. The boy studied them, then said he was bound for town with letters and a parcel for the storekeeper. He said the parcel was from a camp upriver, a camp of men that did not talk much and paid in coin with strange marks. The boy's voice shook when he spoke of the camp. He said he did not go near the fire when he delivered the parcel. He said the fire felt wrong. They let the boy pass. But the woman asked if the town still had the old trader who knew both tongues and dealt fair. The boy nodded. The trader kept a small place near the mill. He had gray hair like river drift and a limp from an old fall off a wagon. He sold coffee and needles, salt and wool. He was known to listen more than he spoke. The man and the woman traded looks. They decided the trader might know more about the men in the circle of tents. They would go at dusk and take the back way into town where the sawdust drifted like yellow snow. The town looked tired at night. The main street held a store, a smithy, a rough eating room, and a shack that called itself a hotel, if a person was not too strict about words. A light showed in the trader's window. The man waited in the alley while the woman knocked. The trader opened the door and peered out with careful eyes. When he saw who stood there, his shoulders eased. He let them in and shut the door tight. The room smelled of leather and coffee. The trader poured water from a kettle and waited for their first words. The woman spoke of the camp by the river and the riders with the red scarf. The trader listened and pressed his lips together. He said the camp bought flour and powder 2 nights ago. They paid with coins minted far to the south and a ring that looked like it had been pulled from someone else's hand. He said a deputy from a nearby county had asked, after a band known for taking horses and laying claim to what did not belong to them. The deputy had a list of marks they left at campfires. A circle cut into the bark of a tree with a single notch at the top. The trader had seen that mark on a cottonwood near the river. The man felt the old promise tighten. The woman asked if the deputy was still in town. The trader shook his head slowly. The deputy had gone west that morning with one partner. 2 men against 20 was poor math. The trader said the deputy was brave but proud, and pride was a thin blanket on a cold night. He reached under the counter and brought out a folded map, marked with rivers and trails. He tapped a spot on the paper where the river bent. That was where the camp had been last seen. The woman memorized it. The trader slid the map back without offering it as a gift. He had learned not to pull pieces of his small order from their places unless he meant it for good. They left the trader with thanks and a warning to keep his door barred. Outside, the town carried a low hum of worry. A woman with a shawl wrapped high around her neck hurried past with a pail of water. A ranch hand leaned against a post and watched the night with eyes that moved more than his mouth. From the edge of town came a string of coughs from the mill. The hum of the saw blade did not stop even in dark. The man and the woman took the back path east, their steps quiet. They did not speak until the lights of town were far behind. The next day they rode along the river, keeping 2 willow thickets and stony ledges where tracks held poorly. The river sounded strong, even though the summer had sucked much of it away. They found the cottonwood with the circle carved into its bark and the notch at the top. The mark was fresh. The woman looked up through the leaves. A magpie shifted and clicked its beak. The man crouched and studied the ground. He found the ash of a fire mixed with chips of metal and a shred from a burlap sack that once held flour. It was not the wasteful blaze they had seen before, but it was large enough to show power. He picked up the burlap shred, rubbed it between finger and thumb, and let it fall back into the dirt. They moved on and soon found a second camp. This one had been left in haste. A kettle lay on its side. A whetstone that someone meant to keep had been dropped near a flat rock. The woman pressed her palm to the rock and felt warmth. The man scanned the far bank and saw a track that looked like a drag mark. Something heavy had been pulled through the grass. He did not say it aloud. He did not need to. The woman's eyes already held the same thought. They mounted and followed the track at a distance, stopping often to listen. Far ahead came the faint ring of metal, an axe striking, then low voices. They slid from their saddles and crept forward through the willows. Across a narrow bend in the river stood a new set of tents. These were closer to the water, half hidden by cottonwoods. Men moved among them with purpose. 2 kept watch from a knoll. A third sat by the fire and studied a sheet of paper as if trying to make sense of a map. The man and the woman could not hear the words, but they could read posture. The watchers were on edge. The reader looked impatient, like someone waiting for a signal that had not yet come. Behind the tents, tied to a rope line, were 5 horses that did not match the others. Sleek, well cared for, with new cuts where ropes had rubbed. Stolen mounts. They stayed until their legs cramped, then eased back through the willows. In the cover of trees, the woman spoke first. The camp was not moving on. It was growing roots thin at first, but roots all the same. She feared the river would be taken next. Water drew power to itself. The man nodded and said they needed more eyes and more hands. He said they should return to their people by a long route to avoid being tracked, and then circle back with a plan shaped by more than 2 minds. The thought of leaving the camp unwatched sat poorly with both of them, but they knew they had no choice. 2 could not hold a river when 20 wanted it. They worked their way north to the hills where sage grows thick and the wind wears a different voice. There they found a quiet valley where an elder kept a herd of small horses and a garden of corn and beans tucked close to the earth. The elder greeted them with a grip like iron and eyes that missed little. He had heard rumors from hunters and from a woman who traded herbs in town. He already knew about the red scarf and the circle cut in bark. He said fences were rising near the sacred spring, and that a rancher had posted a sign on a cottonwood near the water. The sign used letters. but the meaning was plain to anyone who had ever met a boarder. They told the elder about the camp at the river and the horses tied to the rope line. The elder stood still for a long time. Then he told them about a place farther west, where the river split around an island thick with willow. He said long ago, that island had held a council fire where promises were kept. He said promises leave a taste in the soil. He thought the camp would try to take that place next, 'cause taking a place of promise does more harm than taking a place of wood and water. The man felt cold at the thought. The woman looked to the hills and wished for a storm with good hard rain to wash plans clean. The sky gave nothing. They stayed a night in the valley. Others came in the dark, called by the elder's slow drum and low voice. Hunters, an old woman with hands stained by plants, a young rider who had been keeping watch near the spring. They spoke in turns. The young rider said he saw a stranger with a badge 2 days ago, riding alone and asking questions about the camp. The badge meant law of some sort, though laws out here came and went like cattle herds. The elder said the stranger was likely the deputy the trader had mentioned. No one had seen him since. The group fell quiet. The woman thought of the pride the trader had named. The man wondered if the deputy lay hurt somewhere. One more worry added to the pile. By morning a plan began to take shape, more a braid than a line. The young rider would return to the spring and watch the new fences. The old woman would go to town and trade herbs, then listen for news near the mill. The man and the woman would ride back to the river and track any move toward the Willow Island. The elder would send word to distant cousins who knew how to read sign no one else could see and how to leave none behind. No one spoke of a fight. No one had to. Not speaking a thing did not make it smaller. It only kept it from growing too fast. On their way out of the valley, the man and the woman met a settler family heading east with a broken wagon. A wheel leaned at a wrong angle. The father's hands were raw from trying to fix it with too few tools. The mother kept a baby wrapped tight, and a small boy walked beside the oxen with a stick. The man offered a strip of rawhide to lash the spokes. The woman gave the mother a handful of dried berries. The settler father thanked them in a voice that shook with relief. He said there were men by the river who did not trade fair. He said he had sold a horse to one of them for a price agreed at sunset. And by morning the price had shifted and the horse had vanished without any talk of justice. He said he wanted only to move on where no one would trouble his family. The man and the woman nodded and wished him safe road. They did not judge him. The land judged enough for all. They reached the river again 2 nights later. The camp had changed. New tents. More horses. And a pole had been raised near the water with a scrap of red cloth tied at the top. The man watched the cloth twist in the wind and felt his jaw grind. The woman counted heads and saw faces she had not seen before. She also saw a thin smoke line farther west, where the river bent toward the Willow Island. A scout fire. Someone was out there marking the next move. They followed the thin smoke at a distance, taking care not to cross open ground without a test of the air and the light. The trail led to a bluff above the island. There, in the brush, they found a small cooking pit and the imprint of a bedroll. A tin cup lay on its side. Beside it was the print of a boot heel with a star pattern pressed into the leather. Not many use that kind of heel. The woman brushed dirt from the mark and looked to the man. He stared at the star and said the deputy had gone this way. He did not say if that made him hopeful or afraid. Before dawn, a shape moved along the opposite bank. A single rider. The rider stopped near a fallen tree, slid to the ground, and crawled to the edge of the bluff. The man and the woman did not move. The rider peered down at the island for a long time, then turned back toward the river camp. The rider's hat tilted, and the early light caught the drag of a limp. The trader had said the deputy walked clean, not lame. This was not the deputy. This was someone else from the camp, careful and patient. And now the island was in his eye. They pulled back and hid until the sun stood high and hot. Then they slipped away and made for a stand of juniper on a rise, where they could see both the island and the camp. The day stretched thin and brittle. The camp sent out 3 riders toward the island as the sun leaned west. 2 crossed upstream, where the water ran shallow over stones. The 3rd stayed close to the willows and scanned the banks with the long patience of a hunter. Soon after, A fourth rider joined them, the one with the limp. They spoke in tight circles and pointed at the island. The man felt the urge to move, to act, to push back before the ground was lost. The woman placed a hand on his arm and reminded him of the braid of the plan. More eyes were coming. They could not burn the plan in the first spark. As the light failed, the river held a quiet shine, and the island looked like a dark sleeping animal in its middle. The riders from the camp melted into the willows and did not come out again. The man and the woman stayed on the ridge until the stars rose, counting breaths, counting risks, counting the number of ways the next day could go wrong. They did not leave. They did not speak of turning back. They waited with the slow burn of people who know a line is being crossed in front of them and who cannot, yet step forward without breaking more than they save. The wind changed, bringing the smell of smoke from a fire they could not see and the faint trace of something else. Sharp and bitter, like metal on the tongue. Somewhere out there, between river and sky, the first move had already begun. The night clung to the land like a shroud, heavy and close. The man and the woman lay hidden among the junipers, watching the faint glow of firelight that leaked through the willow branches along the river. The island in the middle of the water remained a dark shape, but the camp beyond it stirred with movement that never settled. Horses shifted restlessly on their lines, the jangle of tack carrying clear in the cool air. The two riders counted the sounds, tracing each noise to a shape, each shadow to a purpose. What troubled them most was what they could not see. More men had come, and yet only a few showed themselves at the fires. The rest were hidden, waiting, as if the whole camp had learned patience. The woman whispered that the island would not hold if the camp moved to claim it. The river made a natural barrier, but barriers failed when numbers pressed. The man's hand rested on the hilt of his knife. He said the island was not only ground, it was a memory, and memories had to be guarded even when the body grew tired. He could feel the weight of his father's vow like a stone in his chest. The woman's gaze swept the river again. She said others were coming to watch, to listen, to stand if needed. But until they gathered, the two of them carried the burden alone, as dawn bled into the sky. The camp by the river stirred to life. Men moved with urgency, not the lazy rhythm of travelers, but the ordered pace of a band with intent. One man with a red scarf stood near the riverbank, speaking to two others who pointed toward the island. The woman counted their gestures. She saw how they mapped the crossing in their heads. The man noted the coils of rope stacked beside a tree and the heavy stakes cut from fresh logs. These men did not mean to pass through. They meant to anchor themselves. A distant sound broke the morning stillness. Hoofbeats, faint but steady, drawing closer from the north. The man and woman pressed themselves low and scanned the horizon. Soon, three figures emerged on horseback, riding hard down the ridge. One carried a rifle slung across his back. The other two bore satchels that hung heavy. Dust trailed behind them, catching the sun. They rode straight for the camp. The woman felt her stomach tighten. Reinforcements. The camp swelled even as the watchers waited. By midday, the island seemed smaller, as if the river had shrunk it under the weight of watchful eyes. The man thought of the deputy the trader had spoken of. He wondered if that lone rider had made it this far, or if pride had ended him in silence. Then he saw a flash of movement near the far bend of the river. A rider moved low in the saddle, horse dark and quick. The limp was there in his gait when he dismounted. The same man they had seen before? He crouched near the bank and studied the island with the patience of a hunter. The man's hand curled into a fist. He knew the limp was no weakness, but a mark of someone who had survived too much to be careless. The woman touched his arm, reminding him to wait. They were not yet ready to act. They had only their eyes and their silence, and both had to be kept until the braid of the plan tightened around the camp. Still, she felt her own resolve fray as she watched the campman lay ropes across the shallows, testing their pull, marking paths into the water. She thought of the sacred spring now fenced, the sign nailed to the cottonwood, the way the rancher had claimed what was never his. This would be the same, only greater, and it would not stop at the island. The day wore thin. Each hour stretched like hide on a frame. Birds grew quiet, even the magpies. When the sun lowered, More fires sprang up in the camp. The smell of meat roasting carried across the river. The man wondered if it was stolen, the kind taken from herds driven off in the night. The woman studied the flames and thought they looked wasteful. A blaze meant not only for heat, but for showing power. She whispered that they should slip closer, see what could not be seen from the ridge. The man agreed with a nod. As night fell, they moved like shadows through the willow thickets. Careful to place each step where the ground would not betray them, they reached a hollow near the water's edge where reeds grew tall. From there they could see the camp more clearly. Men gathered around a large fire, passing a jug, voices rough but not careless. Beyond them stood a tent larger than the others, canvas pulled tight, guarded by 2 men with rifles. The man narrowed his eyes. Whoever led this band stayed inside. That meant more was being planned than a simple theft of land. He watched as another man emerged from the tent holding a rolled map. The leader followed, tall, with a heavy coat despite the heat. He took the map, spread it on a flat rock, and pointed with a gloved hand. Those around him leaned close, nodding. The man felt the hair on his arms rise. Maps meant borders, and borders meant control. The woman whispered that they must return to the elder, that they had seen enough. But even as she spoke, a sound split the air. A crack of a branch not far behind them. Both froze. In the reeds, silence became heavy. The man slowly turned his head. A figure stood just beyond the shadows, crouched low, watching them. The glint of metal at his belt told enough. He was not a wanderer. He was from the camp. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the figure shifted, slipping back into the dark with a speed that made the woman's pulse quicken. Their hiding place was no longer hidden. They pulled back, moving swift but careful, retracing their path through the reeds. Every rustle seemed louder than it should. The man glanced behind often, but no shape followed. Still, he knew the watcher had gone to tell. By the time they reached the safety of the junipers, the camp was stirring. A whistle cut through the night, sharp and shrill. Torches flared. The island seemed to shrink even more, caught between firelight and shadow. The man and the woman did not sleep that night. They kept watch in turns, each hour dragging heavy with the knowledge that discovery would come. Just before dawn, they saw riders cross the river to the island. They carried stakes and ropes, setting them in the soft soil. The man clenched his jaw. The woman whispered that the braid must hold, that the elder's word would bring more before the island was lost. But doubt crept into her heart. She could feel the rhythm of the camp, the way it moved with practiced order. This was not a band of drifters. This was a force with a leader, a plan, patience enough to see it through. The sun rose red, and the river caught its light like a wound. Across the water, the camp had doubled. More horses, more tents, more men. The leader with the heavy coat stood tall on the bank, watching as his men worked. The red scarf fluttered beside him. A voice carried across the river, harsh and sure, though the words were too distant to be clear. The man and the woman felt the weight of it all pressing down. The island stood between worlds, and the next move would decide more than water or soil. It would decide who belonged and who did not. The woman thought of the stories told at the council fire long ago, promises spoken into flame. She remembered her mother's voice, steady and strong, telling her that some ground held memory deeper than roots. She felt tears press but held them back. The man thought of his father's vow, the way it had been passed like a torch into his hands. He felt the heat of it now, burning in silence, waiting for the moment to be lifted. Neither spoke. The river spoke enough, carrying the steady beat of stakes driven into the island. The sound of a claim being forced into the land. All around them the air seemed tight, as if the earth itself held its breath. The man and the woman knew they were watching the start of something that could not be turned aside. They could feel the storm gathering, its weight pressing from every horizon. And though the climax had not yet come, its shadow stretched across the river, dark and long, pulling them toward the moment when waiting would no longer be possible. The river glimmered under the first light of dawn, its surface trembling with the pressure of so many hooves crossing it. The man and the woman had stayed awake through the night, their eyes heavy but their hearts sharper than ever. They had seen the camp grow like a shadow that refused to lift. They had felt the island shrink with every stake driven into its soil. Yet, even as they watched, they knew the hour had come when waiting would no longer serve. The storm they had feared was no longer distant. It was here. From the east came a small procession, quiet but certain. Riders from nearby settlements, men and women who had heard whispers carried by wind and rumor. They had been called by the elders' word, by the memory of land that meant more than survival. They rode with steady resolve, their numbers small, but enough to give shape to resistance. Among them was the trader, his wary eyes softer now, and beside him, a boy too young to fight, but old enough to witness. The woman saw the boy and thought of stories passed down, of how memory carried best when young ears were present. The man nodded to the elder as he dismounted. The elder's back was bent, but his gaze carried the weight of time. Unshaken by what loomed ahead, the two sides faced one another across the water. The leader in the heavy coat stepped forward, his boots sinking in the mud of the bank. His voice rang out, harsh, carrying claims of ownership, rights marked on paper, power given by signatures far from this soil. The elder answered, voice steady and quiet, but each word struck like stone. He spoke not of paper, but of blood, of roots, of the long trail that had led to this island. He said the land had memory, and that memory could not be erased by ink. The woman felt her heart swell as the elder spoke. She knew some would not understand. But those words bound them together more tightly than rope. The camp across the river did not answer with respect. A man in a red scarf spat into the water. Another laughed. The leader in the coat lifted his hand, and men began to move ropes and stakes as if the elder's words meant nothing. Tension tightened like a bowstring. The man placed his hand on the elder's shoulder and stepped forward. His voice was calm, but it carried. He said they had seen enough, that the island would not be taken by those who sought to carve it for profit. He reminded them of the missing herds, the stolen water, the deputy who had vanished on this same trail. He spoke of the limp in the rider who scouted for them, a mark left from violence. He told them the river had eyes, and it had seen. For a moment, the camp faltered. The leader's gaze hardened, but doubt flickered among his men. They had come expecting to face silence or fear, not voices that rose with conviction. Yet the leader pressed on, his pride too heavy to turn back. He ordered his men to claim the island. Torches lifted, ropes tightened. The first steps into the water sent ripples across the current. The air seemed to split in two. The boy clutched the elder's robe. The woman's breath caught. The man gripped his knife, though he prayed it would not need to be drawn. Then a horn sounded from the ridge. All eyes turned. Riders appeared, more than expected, their banners small but clear in the rising sun. Among them was a figure with a badge pinned to his chest. The missing deputy had returned, his limp unchanged, but his resolve sharp. He had found others willing to ride, men of law and men of conscience, drawn by the same call that had gathered those below. They came not to spill blood, but to bear witness, to show that the island was not alone. The camp hesitated. The leader's face twisted, anger and calculation warring in his eyes. He knew that to press further now would not bring simple gain. It would bring judgment. The river stilled as the campmen drew back, murmurs passing among them. The man in the red scarf lowered his torch. Another let go of the rope. The leader cursed under his breath, but could not command silence into loyalty. The weight of numbers had shifted, not by force, but by will. Slowly, one by one, the men turned from the water. Horses stamped, ropes slackened, fires dimmed. The island remained untouched. The leader lingered, his pride cracking like brittle wood, before he finally turned his back and mounted his horse. With a barked order, the camp began to scatter, leaving behind the smell of smoke and the imprint of stakes in the soil, but not the island itself. Relief came slow, like rain after drought. The elder stood straighter, his eyes lifting to the sky. The boy let out a breath he had been holding too long. The man and the woman exchanged a glance that carried all the weight of their vigil. They had not drawn blades, yet the fight had been real, sharper than steel. They knew it was not the end of threats, but it was a stand that would be remembered. The deputy rode down to them, his limp making each step deliberate. He said he had been delayed, that betrayal had cost him time, but truth had brought him back. His eyes met the man's, and there was respect there, silent but certain. That night the people gathered on the island. A fire was lit, not in defiance, but in remembrance. The elders spoke of those who came before, of how memory anchored them more firmly than any stake. The woman listened, her heart steady now. She thought of her mother's voice and knew the stories would continue. The man sat beside her, his father's vow fulfilled in a way that was not loud but lasting. He felt no triumph, only a deep calm, the kind that came from knowing he had not let silence bury what mattered. The traitor sat among them, quieter than usual, as if learning the value of what could not be bartered. The boy listened with wide eyes, the flames reflected in his gaze. Carrying memory into the future, in the days that followed, the land settled again. The river flowed as it always had, though those who watched it now saw more than water. They saw proof that unity could hold against pressure, that memory had strength when spoken aloud. The camp that had threatened them did not return. The leader in the heavy coat vanished into distance, his plans scattered like ash. But the lesson remained. The woman walked the island often, her steps careful, her heart light. She knew danger would always find ways to creep back, but she also knew they had shown it could be faced. The man tended to his horse, sharpened his knife, but he carried himself with ease. He understood that vows lived not only in battle, but in the steady act of guarding what was right. When the elder finally rested his head on his blanket and spoke no more, his words lived on in those who had heard them. The boy grew with the memory of that night, carrying the fire in his chest. The traitor told the tale in markets, though softer than most of his words, as if protecting it. The deputy returned to his post, but his gaze was always pulled toward the river where truth had risen higher than law. The man and the woman stayed near the island, watching the seasons turn, watching grass bend in the wind and willows green in spring. Their bond deepened not in words, but in the silence they had shared by the river. When everything could have been lost and yet was not,